This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to the expert session with Mirjam Baltus. She is an expert trainer at Firely and also a developer. So over to you, Mirjam.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you for inviting me here and welcome to you all. As mentioned, I'm Mirjam. I work for Firely, and Firely is a company that is 100% dedicated to fire. That is because one of my colleagues called Ewout Kramer, he is one of the Fire founders. And he got at least some time to invest into creating this standard together, of course, with the other founders, Graham Grieve and Lloyd McKenzie. Well, my boss said, okay, you go ahead and do that. And after some time, when of course the fire specification started out to grow and get more attention, well, they said we need to split this up into a new company that only does work on fire. So I was fortunate to join the fire team in 2012. Actually, that was at the very beginning of the starting of the fire specification, because, well, the first draft was finalized in 2011. And then Ewout took me on to a consultancy assignment so I could learn about fire as well. And well, I'm basically a trainer by heart, so that meant that I could do the fire training courses as of that time. So today, what I will take you through is a look at the Firely ecosystem, so what Firely can offer. And then after that, we will start to take a look at the .NET API for Fire to get you started on creating your own Fire programs. If you want to have the slides, they are on my Dropbox, and there's a short link on this slide as well. So you are welcome to download the PDF that is on there. It does contain some code examples, and that could be useful for later on as well. I will keep this up about 2 weeks or something until I do a next training course and put other stuff in there. So just make sure if you want to have the slides that you download them before I delete them again, but they will be there for a couple more days, at least this week and the next. So yeah, so as you can see from the picture on this slide, this is my setup as I am sitting here today again as well. We had Dev Days 2 weeks ago, and well, that was organized as a virtual event, just like this one, and we had to do a nice setup there, so I could do some well, things on my computer with an extra screen to see what was going on. So I do have my other screen running as well. So if there's anyone who wants to do say something in the chat to me, I have a chat window open, and I will, well, from time to time at least, check whether you have put anything in there, like a question or something. Okay, so what we are going to take a look at first, as I said, is the Firely ecosystem. So that is on this particular slide. At Firely, we provide tooling, we create software for you to use. And also, of course, we do have our consultants. We do have me and another a couple of colleagues that can do fire training courses. And actually, what we have now at Firely is this ecosystem, as you see here on this slide. So what we have on the left-hand side is a tool called Forge. That tool is used to create profiles and extensions. Then, of course, if you're a profile author, you create them, you edit them, and then you can publish them to a platform called Simplifier.net. So that Simplifier platform is meant to be a public platform for all profiles and extensions that people want to put on there, and also some other conformance resources. Simplifier is then used to collaborate. So with a team, you can work on a set of profiles if you want, but also other people can retrieve those profiles and extensions and other conformance resources in order to use them. So one of the things that you could do is put them into something called a fire server, and in Firely terms, that would be the Vonk server. So the Vonk server is a full fire server. We have it running as a public server, but you can also create or buy your own Vonk server. You can try it out as well. So that's an option that you would have if you're interested in running your own Fire server. You could download the Vonk server and then use that and test to see whether that meets all of your needs. But from Simplifier, we can load those profiles and extensions into that Vonk server we have running. And of course, if you are a developer, you can use the Fire.net API in order to create your own Fire programs that can then read and write, for example, to a Vonk server or to any other Fire server that you would have. So all in all, these are this is a nice tool set to start out with, I think. And as said, I'm going to show you a short demo of how this all interconnects and works together. And then afterwards, we are going to take a closer look at that Fire API, so you can start out building your own programs there. So that is what Firely can offer you. And of course, we do have the option to also give training courses. So usually I do Fire overview training courses or Fire profiling training courses. We also have a Vonk workshop where you can learn how to integrate extra code into that Vonk system, or how to run a Vonk server on top of an existing database as a facade layer. So there's a couple of useful links here related to Firely, and they all relate, of course, to that previous slide where I have my ecosystem. The main website is just fire.ly, and then we have a couple of other things running on the Simplifier platform. We have the public Vonk server running on an endpoint there. And you can also see that we have the Dotnet API, which is an open source project. So you can find that source on GitHub if you need to. Okay, so first I'll start off with a quick demo to show you what's around. And then I see that someone can you hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks. Because I saw a message saying that I might be on mute, but I'm not. So fortunately, most of you can hear me. Hopefully, if you can't, something can change and then you can hear me. So I will end the show at this time and move over to this demo of that Firely ecosystem. And then afterwards, we will return and look at the Fire API. So, of course, whenever you start with Fire, actually, instead of looking at the Simplifier platform, you probably end up on the Fire website. So I have that open as well, just hl7.org/fire, which is the main Fire website, and it will show you the latest version of the Fire specification as it has been released. So in this case, we are looking at release 4, which is the main site. Now, in some countries, they have started out with Fire DSTU2 or Fire STU3, which were previous Fire releases. DSTU stands for Draft Standard for Trial Use, for those of you who didn't know that. STU, of course, the D for draft is dropped off, and you end up with Standard for Trial Use. As of release 4, Fire is partly normative, so parts of the Fire specification have gone normative. But if you still need to look at one of the previous versions, those websites are up as well. So you can either look at this link directory of published versions in order to get to a previous version, or if you already know I'm looking for STU3 or I'm looking for DSTU2, you can also append that to the URL on top. So I could add STU3 on there and then browse to that site, and you will see that it looks very similar, but the version of Fire listed on top is release 3 now. And of course, it also tells you that this is not the latest version of Fire. But this could be really useful for those of you who encounter projects where you have to work with the previous Fire version. So all of the versions are available through that directory, but if you have a main version that you want to look at, you can usually also append this to the URL. Just a quick tip there for you to make use of if needed. So the Fire website, of course, tells you all about the Fire specification. And what we are going to take a look at today, at least, is the resources. One of them, in this case, what we are going to take a look at is mainly the patient resource. I'm clicking on the resources tab, and then you can see that we have a whole resource list here. I mentioned that release 4 is partly normative. You can see all of the normative content by looking at these N signs here. So the patient is a normative resource. Other resources are not normative yet. They have a maturity level attached, but you can, of course, still use them and then give your feedback whenever there is a problem, or if you have the need for additions or changes, then you can reach out to the work groups in HL7 to get those changes done, hopefully. So we are going to take a look later on at the patient resource. Also an important tab is the documentation tab, because in this documentation tab, you can see how you can exchange resources. So we are going to take a look at the Restful API later on in when we are going to create our program in order to be able to get the data out of a Fire server or data into a Fire server. So the whole way of doing that is specified in this Restful API page here. So just a couple of quick links there that you could find useful in the rest of this session. So for Firely, what we have created is the Simplifier.net platform, because if you look at the Fire specification, you will see that lots of things are optional and you might want to make things mandatory. You might find the need to create extensions because some data is not on the Fire resource. And that is because the Fire working groups, they decide what is most widely used, and if it's used in 80% of implementations, then that data element will be put in the Fire resource. But if it is not used in those 80% of cases, so 20%, that falls off of the Fire resource, because otherwise the Fire resource types would be getting too complex, too complicated to still work with. So what they have done is create the means to create extensions, because you might still need that data element to be on there. Firely has created this Simplifier.net platform in order to be able to store your extensions and to store your profiles, so they can then be opened up to the public, to other people to work with. It is a public platform and I am logged in at the moment, but that's just because I'm going to do a demo. You can also browse this platform just without logging in, and you don't need to create an account to browse Simplifier.net for any profiles that you want to view. I am not exactly aware of where HL7 India is with profiling, and I know that during the Connectathon you are going to work on Indian profiles as well. I hope that they will end up on this Simplifier.net platform, because that means that lots of people also from outside of India that might not know about it right away can find those profiles and extensions. So this is the project, or the platform to create those profiles on. So I'm going to go to my own portal and show you one of my projects there. Let me see, I have a test R4 project. So this is my test project, and I can take a look at the profiles that I have, or the extension. So I'm just going to click on profiles there. And as you can see, I have two profiles lying around here. One is a profile that has profiled the patient resource, creating extra constraints on that. And another is on a data type. I also have an extension listed here because I have created an extension to be able to capture the occupation of a patient, and I have linked them together. Well, this is my current project, and this project also has an API. If I look at this, this is my project API, and this can be used in order to connect this particular project of Simplifier to my Func server that I have. So that is something that we are going to take a look at in a minute. In order to create profiles, you will need to have a profiling tool. Simplifier itself is just a repository, so it's not a profiling tool. You will need to have a separate tool. And that is why Firely has created the Forge profiling tool. So hopefully this shows. Yes. So this is, well, a different window here. I have a profiling tool and it's called Forge. So that is what Firely has created in order for you to do profiling. And I know that this might sound like a very quick thing that we are going to go through. It's just an overview of the possibilities you have. And during the rest of the Connectathon, you will be able to get more experience with these kinds of tools and start working with them. I also have a profiling session on Friday, so at that time we will take a deeper look into profiling. So I'm just going to make you familiar with the tooling, and after that I'm going to show you a little bit more about the Fire specification and then creating some Fire applications. So hopefully you will see it in that sense, just an overview of all kinds of possibilities that you would have with Fire. And of course, I would welcome any questions that go deeper into specifics later on as well. And we will have some time for Q&A today. So just to show you, I'm going to create a profile. I'm going to have to open a profile folder. I've already created one. And what I'm going to do is take a look at that patient resource and create some extra constraints on there. So I'm going to find the patient here. Okay, and you can see there is this name here. A profile will always have something called a canonical URL. That is a unique identifier for that object, for that profile. So I usually name it something like Mirjam's patient or something like that. So let me just keep it like that in default and click OK. So what this tool now does, it takes a look at the standard patient. And it takes that structure that is underlying the Fire standard patient and reads it in. Now it shows me on my screen that particular structure. And if I go to the Fire website and click on that patient resource, then you can also see that we have the same fields on the patient on the website as we see right now in my Forge tool. So let me just quickly do that. So I'm going to go to the resources on the Fire website and show you the patient resource here. So the patient resource structure is on this Fire website, and you can see that we have a whole list of data elements within that patient resource listed on the left here. Then you can see that there is a cardinality attached to all of these fields, and for patient they are all optional because Fire needs to be able to be used in all kinds of use cases and contexts. So you cannot make too many things mandatory, because then in certain countries they might say, oh, we don't have that bit of data, but it's mandatory in Fire, so we can't use the Fire specification. Of course, HL7 didn't want that. We want the Fire specification to be able to be used everywhere in healthcare. So we can see a whole list of these data elements, and we see this cardinality, and they also have a certain type attached to that particular field. So that's the patient resource. Now, if I switch over back to the Forge tool again, you can see that we have these same fields listed here. If that field has subfields like identifier, we have collapsed them at first, but we can just click on any of those fields. And then, of course, it's a little bit of a different view than on the Fire website, but in this view, we can change things. So we can say, for example, it's important for us that the birth date is on the data that gets sent to us. So we could create that to be a mandatory field. So you can see the cardinality has been changed from 0 to 1 to 1 to 1. And it shows in bold-faced letters here as well. Same could be done for gender. And I'm not going to create a complicated profile, but I'm just going to create these extras here. We want these things to be on the data. And now what I can do when I'm satisfied with my profile, I can upload this to the Simplifier platform. So let me just do that by doing publish to Simplifier. I will have to choose my project, and it has already connected to Simplifier on startup, so I will have to choose the correct one. If you start out with Simplifier with a free account, you can have just one project. And well, I have a lot of projects listed just because I'm a part of a lot of collaborations on the platform as well. So this was the project that we looked at previously, and I can now publish my profile to that project. So it has published this now. I can also save it to my file system here just to have it available locally. But if I switch back to my Simplifier platform, you see that we still have these three things listed that we had previously. So we have my two profiles and my extension on here. But if I refresh this, there should be an extra one. And that's this one, the Mirjam's patient. So that is my profile. Whenever you have a set of profiles, usually what you want is that people then start using those profiles to create their data, but you also will want to be able to validate against that particular profile, right? Because if anyone sends you data, you want to be able to see, okay, does this patient conform to Mirjam's patient? Or does this patient conform to the HL7 India patient profile? So I published this to Simplifier now. And what we can do is use that profile and upload this into our Fire server if we want. So that is a question that is on the chat as well. So we can import those profiles or publish them to our Fire server if we want. Usually what I do is take this route. I put everything in my Simplifier project, but if you looked at my file publish to Simplifier option just now in Forge, there is also the option to publish to a different Fire server. There are a couple of ways of do that. What I could also do is take a look at the JSON or the XML of this particular structure, because there is a Fire structure behind this. So this is my patient profile. Let me just click on the hybrid view so you can see what I have changed. I have changed that gender and that birth date, but there's the option to click on XML or JSON, whichever you prefer. Usually these days you see a lot of JSON there, and you can see that this is a resource of type structure definition, which is a Fire resource type. And the Fire structures are defined like this in Fire resource types. So we have this, and we could copy that content and then also publish that to a Fire server. So as I said, that would be a couple of options there. But since I work with the Firely tooling ecosystem, I can make it easy. I have the Forge tool to create my profile. I have the Simplifier platform to publish them. So myself, but also other people can find it and use it. And then I have the Vonk server, and I can use the Vonk server to import this profile into it. And that's the next step that I'm going to show you. So in my case, I have a local Vonk server running. Well, it's not running at this time, but I can show you that there is a setting. And you can see here that I import everything from that Mirjam Test R4 project from Simplifier into my Vonk server. Whenever I have done that and I start up the Vonk system, it will check whether there's new content and it will import that. And as of that moment, Vonk, or my Vonk, is capable of validating against that particular profile. So let me just start my Vonk again. I had prepared this previously, but not with the profile, of course, because that has just been created. So this is just the start of a Vonk that you see running around there. But what I can do now is use any HTTP tool that I have, an HTTP client, in order to check whether that structure is on there. So I would need a couple of things. I will need this canonical URL. So I'll just copy this for a minute so I don't have to type it in everywhere. And I'm going to start the Postman tool in this case, just because that is an HTTP client I'm familiar with. If you have a different HTTP client, you can run that if you want. So I could do a simple get, and I'm going to do this on my local Vonk system. So let me just do this. And I know that this will be in the administration part of the Vonk system. Administration. And it is a structure definition that has a URL of this particular, with this particular URL string in there. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to retrieve a structure definition, which is that profile, with this particular unique identifier that I have put in there in the Forge tool. So if I do a get on that, I should be getting back a nice bundle there that contains this structure definition, and you can see that is Mirjam's patient. So this is at least confirmation for me that my Vonk system now has this particular structure in place. And as soon as you have it in place, you can then send data to the Vonk system and have that validated against this particular structure. So that's another step that we could do. What we are going to do is post something to my local Vonk. I'm doing this locally because that is more easy than using the public server to upload these structures to, and not, I don't want to pollute that too much. I can, of course, upload structures to the public Vonk server as well, because it just works the same as the one that I have running locally. I could create a patient on the Vonk system. Creating a patient with HTTP is done with an HTTP post to your endpoint, to your Vonk system in this case, and then to the name of the resource type. So this is what I have to do. I will also have to fill in a header, and the header that I want to fill in is a Fire JSON. So that is this content type header, because that tells the server what I am sending to it. Of course, I still need to fill in something in the body as well, because that is the data that I want to send. And what I'm going to do is first open up my patient that I have prepared earlier in order to, well, have this used there. So I will be able to set metadata. Let me see. It's just one. So what I'm doing here is if I'm doing it correctly, at least. That's always a question there. What I'm doing here is I have a patient resource in JSON with some data inside. And what I want to do is send this to my Vonk system and see whether it can validate against that new profile that I have just added to that system. Well, in order to do that, I will have to say to Vonk, okay, this patient conforms to this particular structure. That is this profile tag that is on this data. So let me see if I've done this correctly. I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to put that in my Postman body. And now I can send this to the Vonk system, and it should try and validate against that particular profile that is listed, if my JSON is correct, that is. Okay, so what you see here is my response from the Vonk system is 201 created. That means that my request was successful, so I didn't make any mistakes here. So what I did is in my profile, remember that I made mandatory the gender field and the birth date field. Well, let me test to just take this out and create this patient again. Hopefully we get an error now. And you can see instead of the 201 created, I get this bad request. There was something wrong. And in this case, it says instance count for patient birth date is 0, which is of course not 1-to-1. It is not on the data. So this is where the Vonk system has now used my profile and validates incoming data against that profile. And in this case, of course, since it's not valid, it rejects that. And this data will not be created on my system. There is a question, there must also be a Restful API operation, and yes, there is. Instead of just posting it like this, I could have also done post to the operation $validate. I'm not sure if that was what you meant, Santosh, but this could also be done. In this case, you do not create it, but just perform the validation operation. In this case, I do get a 200 okay, but that's just the operation was successfully run, but it did generate an operation outcome with an error inside. So Santosh, publishing the profile can be done by uploading it to a structure definition endpoint. So as you can see from this particular GET request here, the Vonk system has an administration layer. And if I upload anything to this structure definition part, just like I just did with the normal patient on the normal endpoint, I can upload a profile to that. And as of that moment, at least the Vonk system is capable of using that for validation again as well. So it's a couple of ways to do that. Yes, so an upload is done with a post. That is, a post is a create. So I have heard that that not everyone knows everything about Fire yet, so that is a bit difficult for me to at least know who is knowing what and who doesn't know things. But in this case, that create is done with a post, with HTTP post. The get I've shown you just to retrieve data from the Vonk system. You also can do a put, which is an update. And a delete as well, which of course deletes the data from the system. So if you created something in the Forge application, that means it depends on where you save it. So if you save it locally, that structure will just be on your system. And that is another question I see in the chat there. So I could just go to my Forge again. I didn't save it yet, but I can save this structure. Forge always will save in XML, but it doesn't necessarily matter if you use XML or JSON, but I've saved it to that folder that I have on my desktop, which is this test folder now. So this is just an XML version of that profile that I have, and you can see this is a structure definition, and it is this Mirjam's patient structure definition. So now it's local on my system. If you publish it to Simplifier, then of course you can also download it from there again as well. So if you want to publish it to other people and they need to use that, let me go to Simplifier again. Then I'm still on my Mirjam's patient profile here. You have the option to download. If you're not logged in, you don't have all of these buttons, but the download button will be on there. And of course, you can only reach public projects. So Simplifier is meant to be a public platform for people to be able to use it without having to log in. Of course, if you need to publish your profiles, you need to have an account, but still a project that you create then is public. We also have options for private projects on Simplifier, but then there is a pricing plan attached. And I'm not wanting to do a commercial talk today, just give you an overview of tooling that might be useful to you, and not necessarily sell anything. I'm not an account manager. So I'd rather show you just some things that you can do without having to pay for it. And this is all done with things that you don't necessarily have to pay for right away. If you are going to create things commercially with the Forge tool, then of course you will need to check the license to see. So this is just a quick overview of all of those things that you can do. And we have now successfully created a profile, which is more of a specification and more constrained on a normal Fire structure. And then we've used that in the Wonk server in order to validate. The fourth part of that particular ecosystem, that is of course the API, and that is the next step that we would do. By the way, I did see some questions about those RESTful interactions, right? So let me remind you to take a look at the Fire website, and then you can go to documentation and click on that RESTful API there. That page will list all of the syntax that is needed for the RESTful interactions. So you can see that there is an overview of all the interactions that you could want to do. It depends, of course, if your system supports it or not, but it is the whole list of specified Fire interactions. And you can pick any of them and click on them in order to view the syntax. So for a create, let's click on that one. You can see we use this post to a server and then to the resource type in Fire. So, for every of those interactions, you will see a similar syntax bar, so you can take a look at that and see what you have to fill in, etc. So this is something that you might want to play around with during the pre-Connectathon and Connectathon phases. Just take out a Postman tool or any other HTTP tool and try a public Fire server to, perform any of those interactions. So our question is, I validated the patient resource with the birth date extension in it and was successful. Yes, so I don't know if there's a birth date. There's a birthplace extension, I think, inside. So this one is an extension inside of my patient. This is one of the Fire standard extensions. I will show you where to find them because they are also important. You can find them on Simplifier, but of course you will not necessarily know that they are standard extensions. So let me just go back to the patient resource. And for each resource type, the structure of the page is the same. So I'm looking at the patient resource type now, but if you have another type that you need, you can find these same tabs on top there. So if you look at profiles and extensions, you can see that we have a whole list of standard defined extensions. So HL7 has already created those, and you can use patient birthplace, birth time, etc. on your data. Now the Wonk server loads in all of the standard structures. So that means the normal Fire patient, etc., the resource and data types, but also all of the standard extensions that are already on the Fire specification, because you can download them all in one big zip file. And well, the Wonk system just does that and implements them right away. So I do not need to do anything extra in order to validate against any of the standard structures, any of the standard extensions. That will just already be part of the Wonk system. And the last question I see there is, can we create a profile in Forge and then upload it to your own JPA server and not Wonk? Yes, of course. The answer is yes, you can, because it is a Fire structure. So it is a Fire resource and you can upload them to any Fire server. Now, I don't know enough about your JPA server to know whether that structure then is also used for validation. That is a step that I do not know about. In the Wonk server, I do know about that because I just know where to put it in order to have Wonk use it for validation. And that's what I did in my demo. But it is just a Fire resource type. And since it's a Fire resource type, you can send it to any Fire server you like. So, and of course, then it can be used on that server for validation if you know how to configure that. Yes, and also the base definitions, we have preloaded them into Forge as well, of course, because that is the base upon which you create your own profiles. So, and I do see another question about ignoring extensions. That is something that you can set in your settings in Wonk as well, in order to well, ignore anything that it doesn't know about. But since I did that validate, and I have my validation on strict because I usually like to know what is not good there. So that's just a preference, but that's something that you can configure as well. Okay,
Sure,
well,
Mirjam.
let us do some work then. Yes.
Yeah. If you are asking a question, please prefix question and then ask the question. And if somebody is answering the question, right, just put an answer as the prefix so that Mirjam has clarity on what are the questions and what are the answers, right? What she has to answer.
Okay.
Thanks, Mirjam.
Good.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm trying to follow the chat. It could be that I miss out on some questions because, of course, when you ask a lot of things, it scrolls by. But I'm happy that you at least ask some questions, and hopefully I have been able to clarify a couple of things there. So now, in order to get you started with creating your own programs as well, that's the developer part actually of that ecosystem, we are going to take a closer look at the Fire API. So that is the next part of the presentation as well. And of course, well, I have a Visual Studio environment running here on my system, and the Fire Dotnet API, well, it is .NET based, of course. So we were a .NET based company already before we started out with Fire, and that means that, well, when Ewout started with creating the Fire specification, they started out with the view that it should be easy for developers to get started, right, with any specification that they wanted, in this case, the Fire specification. It should be something that developers could work with, because if developers can't work with the standard, then the standard would not get adopted. At least that was the view in 2011. I do agree with that. You need developers to be able to quickly, easily, hopefully get up and running with a standard in order to then integrate that in their tools. So this is about the .NET API. Of course, there is also a Java equivalent, because Ewout was not the only one working on Fire. And well, there was a group of people that were working on the Happy library. That is also already a Happy library for HL7 v2. And they, when Fire started out, they started creating those libraries for HL7 Fire. So if you want to do the Java part, then you would use the Happy library. This presentation is about the .NET API, but if you want to take a look at Happy, you will see similar things. Syntax is a little bit different, of course, because Java and C#, well, they look alike, but they are not the same. But you will encounter the same things that we have in the .NET API, also in the Hapi libraries. So if you are a Java developer, then hopefully there's still some thing of interest in this next part of the presentation. Well, the libraries for HL7 Fire, they are available through NuGet. So what you would do is check out the NuGet browse for Fire. You could include the pre-release packages if you wanted to, but well, you should be able to see the HL7.fire.r4 package if needed. Of course, you can also use HL7, wrong button. Fire SU3 or DSU2. There's still a library for that as well, but not widely used anymore. And there's also a preview for R5, but that is only visible when you do the preview releases. The Fire library offers you the model. So the complete specification has classes that are generated from that specification in the model of that Fire library. Also, of course, we do have REST functionality in the Fire client. There is parser and serializer functionality, and also some other helper functions there as well. You could also download a different package for validation, the specification package, and there's a lot of things about validating your work in code if you want to. All of that can be found on GitHub, so you can take a look at that source. And we also have some documentation on our docs website there. So, well, depends on what you want to do, but we are going to first take a look at some simple things in there. So one of the things, of course, what you are going to use is the Fire model, so, since that is generated from the specification. In this case, we have a Fire resource called observation. And you can see that we have on the left again a couple of fields there, data elements, and then they have a cardinality and they have a type. And if you look at the libraries, then you will see that same class or that same resource type as class. So in this case, we are looking at the observation class. Technically, almost every resource derives from something called domain resource, and you can see that in the class structure as well. Domain resource gives the option to put an extension on that particular resource type. So the extension field is inherited from the domain resource class, just like it is actually in the real Fire specification as well, if you look at the website. So for each of the resource types and each of the data types, you will find a class. Now, if there is something that has this list attached to it, so let me see if I can find it. Yep. So here we have an observation status, which says required. This means that on this field here, status, it is of type code. The code that you have to fill in has to come from the list that is listed here. You see a couple of options. There are more. That's the plus sign there. If you would be on the Fire website and click on observation status, you will see the whole list. Since this is a required list, it means that the list of codes that you can fill in is fixed. And that means that the Fire specification, or the library at least, can give you an enumeration of that in order to be able to fill in the particular code with a valid code. So whenever you see that required at the end of a list, you will also see that there is a public enumeration with all of those codes in there that you can use. And if you want to fill this in, if you've created a new observation, you can then fill the status with that one of the codes from that enumeration. And so this is a code example at the bottom there that does that. So I do see a good question, and I will answer that in a couple of minutes, Aditya, if you don't mind. So we are going to take a look at questions after I've run through these slides, and then we can handle those. If you have data type listed there, you can see we have these codable concept there as well, which is one of the fire types. So for everything in the fire specification, if it has its own fire type, we have created a class with the same name as that type. So in this case, that would be codable concept. Sometimes you will see that if you have a constructor for that class, in this case for the codable concept class, you have a quick way of filling in some of the data. So we could fill in a system and a code and a display value on the codable concept type already in order to get all of the subfields filled in correctly. If we have 0 to star, a list of things, in this case it's a list of identifiers, most often in the library you will see that this translates into a list of the identifier type, or a list of the type that is the type for that particular field. So in this case, we see that we have a public list identifier, which is a part of that identifier field. And that means that you can just use any of the normal .NET or link parts in .NET to add to the list and do things with that list. So in this case, what we can do is to the identifier field, add a new identifier with a particular naming system and identifier code attached to that. Looking at the Fire website, you can encounter these groups of data. And in this case, we look at component, which is a field in the observation type. And it is a 0 to star list of type backbone element. Well, this backbone element you will not encounter much because it is just a container type. And whenever you see this in the Fire specification, then if you look at the .NET library, we will have a separate class that is part of that main resource type class. So a subclass in the observation would be the component class. It takes the name of the field. So in this case, that would be component. And then at the end, a component is appended to it. If the name of the field were different, then of course that would be the first name of the part, and then it would still say component. If I want to fill this block of information in, I will have to first create one of the new components and then fill the values, and then still add that to my component class. So in this case, that would be done here. So we create a component object, which is a component. Then we fill in the values, and then to the observation component field, we add that particular new component that we've just created. So that's done with every of those sub blocks that you encounter. Whenever you have a backbone element, you would create a new component object and then add that to that list later on. Now, one of the things that you could encounter in the Fire specification is something that we call choice properties. Choice properties mean that you have a choice of data type to fill in a particular data element. So what we're looking at this time is the value field. So we have the value field here in observation, and it is an X is attached to that. That X, that means that this is a choice property. The list of possible choices is listed below. So we can fill in a value of type quantity, a value of type string, a value of type Boolean, etc., etc. So there's a whole list of that. The library will not know beforehand what you are going to choose. So the only thing that you could see in the library is that we have to take the parent type of all of these data types that are in the Fire specification. That parent type is called element. So if you look at the definition of that value field in the observation resource, then you can see it is of type element. You will first have to create a new type of any of the chosen types, the type you want to choose, and then add that to that value field. So that is an example here where we've created a new quantity, fill it in with some values, and then add that quantity to the component.value field. You will have to first set that new type or that fire type in order for the library to be able to check whether that type is a subclass of element. So we have in Fire something we call primitive values and complex values. Primitive data types, complex data types. The primitive data types just take a value directly. So think about a string, a Boolean, an integer, that kind of thing. It takes a value directly. The non-primitives, the complex data types, are things like that codable concept that we've seen, that quantity, because that contains subfields. Now, for every of the complex types, they usually have names that do not have any conflict with the normal programming data types. So we can just create a class of the codable concept type or of the quantity type. That is done in the Fire libraries. But for some of the primitives, they conflict with that normal .NET data type, like string or like Boolean. For all of those types, we have a counterpart called fire string or fire Boolean. So in this case, well, this is just a normal thing that we fill in. If you encounter that particular field of a primitive type, so in this case, that status field, you can see in the object that you've created, in that observation object, that you have two fields. You have a status field and you also have a status element field. The one is the .NET data type, so that would be the status field. The other one is the Fire native type, and that in this case would be the code data type there. It both ends up in the same field internally in your in-memory object. But so as you can see, we have a status field that we can just fill in, or we have the status element that we can fill in. The reason that we do this is because everything in Fire can be extended. You can also extend the primitives. So if I have a string element, then I can still put an extension on that field. But if I look at the .NET string type, that does not know about extensions, right? So we could not fill an extension on a normal .NET string. If we need to fill in an extension on that primitive string, we need to use that field name element part. And I have a small example here at the end where you can see I can fill in the name.family, which is a string type field. So this is the .NET string, but it has a counterpart called family element, which is the Fire string. And that family element has the option to add an extension to it. I do have to fill it in with that Fire string type because, well, that is the Fire way of filling in a native data type there. So name.family, you can just fill in with a simple string and it will just end up correctly inside of your object. But if I need to add an extension, I will have to use that element part. So usually you can just disregard that X element thing, but if you work with extensions, then you will need that. Okay, so that was a little bit about the Fire model. Now, whenever you have data, you can communicate that with a Fire RESTful server by using the RESTful part of the library. So that would be HL7.fire.rest. There are multiple publicly available Fire servers, and I have a link here. I know it's an old link, but it still has a lot of useful information. And there's also a new link to the new Confluence website of HL7 on there. In the library, what I'm going to do is create a new Fire client and then set that to my endpoint. So in this case, that would be the Wonk server or any of those other URLs that you can find on that website. This does not do anything yet. It just creates an in-memory client object, and it does not reach out to the Fire server yet. Whenever you start using an interaction, then of course the network is used and your Fire server is accessed. So with that Fire client, we can do CRUD interactions, create, read, update, delete. And this slide is an example of the first one, so of the create. We create in memory a new observation, fill it in with all of the fields that we have. Of course, we have to check the Fire website to see which fields are mandatory. For patient, I know there's none mandatory, but for observation, we do have a couple of mandatory fields. So you will have to fill them in, and any other fields that are relevant for that observation, of course. And then you can create this on the Fire server with the client. So we can send that to the Fire server with a client.create interaction. That client.create will want you to tell it what kind of resource type to use. So in this case, that would be observation. And then, of course, you send in that object. This will result in the creation of that observation on the system, but it could also generate an error. So if there was anything wrong with your observation, for example, if you forgot to fill in a mandatory field or something like that, or the server just does not accept any rights to it, then this will generate an error, and usually with demos I do not do that, but you should set up error handling to catch any exception that results from your interactions, of course. Then you also have the option to read things, which is of course the read interaction there. You will have to provide again the resource type, and then you fill in the exact technical ID for that patient, or update, which is the client.update, or the delete, which is a client.delete. This can be done in two ways, that delete. You can delete the object that you have in memory, and then the Fire client will check what the technical ID was and send the instruction to the server to delete it. Or if you don't have that object in memory, you can provide that technical ID with it to be deleted on the server. Of course, the Fire client can also give you the option to search things, because the read is just for retrieving a single resource, but you will need to have that technical ID. You will need to know where on the server that particular object lives. If you don't know, but you, for example, do know the name of a patient or the birth date of a patient, then you would perform a Fire search. Again, using that Fire client that we've just seen, you can also perform a search. We will need to create a query object in the form of a search params object in the library, and we can fill that in with key value pairs. So for example, with this where clause here that says where name equals Ewout. We can do other things like including extra data. So in this case, if we're going to search this on the patient resource type, we can also say, okay, I want these patients that have the name Ewout, but also include any organizations that are linked to this patient. We could limit the search results to a number of 10. If the server sends me back 50 and I'm a small lightweight app, I might not want to have 50 at one time. I just want to have those first 10 or first 3 even. So you can have all of these kind of things. Someone did ask a question about that are on the Fire website. Those flags could indicate with a sigma that a particular element or data element is part of the summary of that resource. And we can, with the query, also ask for just the summary of those resources. That means that we get a limited set of data, only those things that have a sigma attached to it and the mandatory fields that are in the specification, they will be sent back. And we could also include a sort order if we wanted to. You could also, instead of using this fluent notation, just add key value pairs to that query object. And there's an example here where we add gender equals male to the search query. So this is just preparing your search, and then we are going to perform the search with a client.search. Now, if you do a fire search, you will always get back a bundle. That bundle can be an empty bundle if nothing matches your filters, but there will always be a bundle as a result to your search. So that is why I capture that bundle here as the result bundle. That bundle will have, if it does have results in it, and it will have a list of entries. And those entries contain the real resources. So here is an example of that, where we have a bundle, that result, and for every entry in that result.entry list, we can say, okay, we want to do something with the resource inside. So in this case, because I searched patients, I could cast that resource inside of the entry to the patient resource and then do something with that. There's also a mechanism to do paging. So in this case, what we do is looping through all of the bundles that get sent back to the server, asking for the next page all of the time. And in the end, this client.continue will end up with a null as a result. So that is where the loop will end. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the questions, and then we could just quickly start with a small project there in Visual Studio. So I'm just going to check the questions here to see if I have missed something. Okay, so yeah, so HL7, the .NET library is open source, so you can download it, the source, from GitHub if you want to. You can also contribute to it if you want to. We do have strict rules about that because we do have a quality check on there. But if you have any additions or if you have bug reports, just go to GitHub and well, feel free to join in the discussions there and well, participate or well, give bug reports, etc. So that is one of the things that was asked there. I also saw, does the .NET API cover a library to build a Fire server? I think it's a really good question. The Fire library has the complete Fire model. And for example, our Vonk server is built with the .NET library. It does not have any server parts inside of it, the Fire library. But if you create your own .NET API web server, you can then make use of all of the models inside of the Fire library in order to, well, give that form and implement that particular Fire layer in there. So that's what we have done with the Vonk server. We've built that with the Fire libraries. Also, if you look at the Microsoft Azure for Fire API or their service, at least, they have built that with the Fire library, the official .NET Fire library that we maintain. But well, they were aware of that work, fortunately, and they said, we don't want to repeat all of that. We just use what's out there, and they came to our library and they use it in their products. So it is possible to create a Fire server with all of the things that are available to you in the Fire libraries. I didn't mention that, or at least I don't have any slides about that in this presentation because time would be too short, but there is options to validate inside of the libraries. So that thing where we have implemented the $validate operation in the Vonk server, we use the .NET library to use those validate mechanisms inside of there in order to validate the Fire data. So all of that is possible. You will still, of course, have to do some work because you will have to set up your Fire server. But yes, you would use the model. You could even use the Fire client if you have to relay any of the requests to another Fire server. You can create in your own server a Fire client object and then reach out to another Fire server if needed. So lots of possibilities there. So all of our tooling is built on the Fire library, the Wonk server, then the Simplifier platform as well, and it uses a Wonk server internally as the repository server. And of course, the Forge tool I've shown you, that is also based on the .NET libraries and based on the Fire structures that are out there. So it will just load them into the Forge tool and then create things. All of those things are available in the Fire libraries. Also, if you're going to do profiling, snapshot generation, just to throw out a term there, that is part of the Fire.NET libraries as well. So a lot of things are possible with the Fire libraries, even though it is not a server as such. I know that the Happy libraries offer that JPA Happy Fire server. We do not, but if you want to take a look at an open source Fire server built with .NET libraries, then take a look at Spark, S-P-A-R-K. That was our previous server. We don't maintain it anymore at Firely, but there is a maintainer of that particular server out there. And if you go to our GitHub site, to the Firely team GitHub, where the API is also, you are capable of finding that Spark server on there as well. And that is a Fire web server that is open source and uses the Fire.NET libraries as well. So yes, please share the link for that. So the link for the Fire.NET library, that is in my slides. And well, let me just end this particular show and go back to the site there. So let me just go to GitHub and I will try and show you this. So if you just go to github.com/Firely team, the link to the Fire.NET API is on there. And you can see that we have a repository listed here that is called Spark, which was our DSTU2 open source Fire server. It has been ported to STU3 and I think also to R4 now, but since it's no longer maintained by Firely itself, I do not know the exact status of it. But that is the open source Fire server working as well with the .NET libraries. So that is a good option to take a look at, I think. So I hope that answers that particular question about that. Aditya, the downloads page is a good one as well, but that does not contain that that server or the libraries. That just has the Fire specification as downloads in there. So we do use that. The Fire.NET API downloads the structures that are in the zip file on that downloads page of the Fire specification, of course, and then all of the classes are generated from that. But you will not find the code that I mentioned here. So another question there is if there are any libraries that we support for serialization of Fire resources and also measure the performance of bulk data loads. But last thing is separate, of course. We do have, I think, we do have a tool that is meant to do performance testing, but I will have to check whether this is on the site. So not yet. So that is probably, it was called the wind tunnel, but it's not on here. Oh yeah, it's on here. So this is the answer to the second part of your question. You could do some performance testing. I'm not really sure how well that works with bulk upload, but the other part of the question where you ask about the serialization, in the normal .NET Fire libraries, you are capable of using the serialization and parsing mechanisms there. If you take a closer look at the Fire formats in JSON and XML, it's a bit Fire flavored JSON and Fire flavored XML. So you can't make do with normal JSON serializers or XML serializers. But in the Fire libraries, there is a Fire serializer and a Fire parser that you can use to parse data or serialize data as well, which is actually what the Wonk server does, because in memory, we build a response to any request sent to it, and then we serialize that to the JSON or the XML format that the client asks for. Well, as you can see, there's a couple of other tools that we have that could be useful as well to just take a look at. Torinox is a command line tool to help you upload or work with packages and things like that. And we also have a Wonk loader, which is basically also a command line tool where you can use what you can use to upload a zip file of fire data. So those could be useful, and that wind tunnel as well for performance testing. So lots of possibilities. Okay, so let me see. I have, I think, another 10 minutes, right? So let me see. Okay, so yes, so the last one coming in there. Can we build an IG, an implementation guide using Simplifier? Yes, so that can be done with Simplifier, and I could show you that. We could also do that, that's a little part with Visual Studio if you want, but you will have to have a project. You will have to be logged in. So let me just go to this one here. This is my test project anyway. There's this tab called Guides, and you can create a Simplifier implementation guide here. This will result in an implementation guide resource. And let me see if I can just quickly edit this one. So I have just created a simple thing where we render my training patient profile there, and I could add some markdown text to it. But we can take a look at the style. And we can make it this palatable style. It's not completely the same as the US core profiles, but we could use this as a first part there. So let me just click on browse so you can see what this results in there. So, well, it's not very much yet because this is a very simple implementation guide, but you can create a whole menu on the top and you will have this, this particular, bit more HL7 flavor onto that implementation guide there. Yeah, so it's different from what you see if you look at the HL7 implementation guides, yes, but we are working on being able to create a Simplifier implementation guide, and then, for example, running that also through the implementation guide publisher that creates those HL7 implementation guides. It's not working 100% yet, so that's a work in progress for us to align that with that tooling. But yes, you can create an implementation guide in Simplifier as well. My example is not too good here, I know that, but if you go to the Simplifier homepage, you could find other implementation guides by looking at this implementation guides tab that is on there, again, public, and there is a lot of examples on here, so you can just browse through that and see if there's something that is nicer looking than my very small example. Okay, so I was talking about the Fire.net API, and I will just show you quickly my test project. I was going to do this right away just by typing it in, but for privacy's sake, I will just show you what I've got on here. So what you can see here is I added through NuGet, I added the HL7 Fire R4 libraries. And in this case, I'm just using the model and the REST part. I could also do something with using HL7.fire.serialization, which is the part of the library that you want to use when you do parsing and serializing. Of course, I don't need that for this particular example, but you could take a look at the methods that you would have there. So there's a Fire serializer, Fire to XML, and Fire to JSON serializer, and also a parser for those. So what I have done here is create this new Fire client, which is just the in-memory object. Then I'm saying, okay, create a new observation with all of the codes that I had on my slide. So if you have downloaded the PDF, and I will give you the link in a minute for those of you who might have missed that. If you have the PDF, you can just copy paste that code, and then you should be able to do things like that. So I have filled in several of these things. And then in the end, what I'm doing here is create that observation there in on the server. So this will send that observation to the server. I will just see if I can quickly run this, see if this will build. And I am expecting an error to occur, by the way, because what I did not do is do any of the a check to see what I have, what mandatory fields I have to fill in. So let me see, why doesn't this work? Okay, now we are there. So it did work. Okay, yeah. Oh, well, then that means that I did fill in everything. So what I did is create a new observation, fill it in with these values, and then the creation here has sent that to the Fire server. And in my result, as you can see, I have an observation. Well, suppose I had forgotten something, I would have had an exception thrown. But in this case, my result is this. So this is an observation with a particular technical ID that now has been created on the Wonk system. And you can see all of the, well, example code and things like that are in there. So this is in code. So let me just quickly copy that particular ID. I can check this and see with Postman whether that is really on the Wonk system, right? So I have just created this one, Wonk not fire R4, and then it was an observation. Let me just do this and paste in that particular technical ID. So in Fire, for those of you who are not too familiar with Fire yet, in Fire, every object, every resource instance, when it is created on a Fire system, it gets this technical ID that is a unique identifier in order to then retrieve that data again. So in my code, I have just created an observation, and I, in the result, got back this technical ID. And that means that since it's a public server, any of you could copy this and then, well, find my information, or I can do that myself as well. So I can send this to my system, and you can see we have an observation with the status of preliminary with a code example 1, 2, 3, etc. So this is all the things, if you look at my code, that were filled in with the value quantity in that component, etc. And the technical ID is listed on here as well. That is something that I did not create, but that is what the server gives this observation as unique indicator. So this is an option there. I am not sure if I can share a Postman collection because I do not really have a Postman collection. I did fill in a couple of things, but that's mainly on my normal, on my local Wonk server. But this one is on the public one. We are still thinking about creating a Postman collection with simple examples there. But other question I see up there is about the link to the presentation, and I promised I would show that again for those of you who missed out on that on the first part. And that would be the link here, bit.ly, and then Mirjam's training. So that would be my this particular presentation that is on there. So that could just be used to copy and paste that code for that observation if you wanted to. You could also do that search. I would advise you to put in a couple of different search parameters there, because I'm not sure that the eval patient is still on our Wonk server. We do load in all of the Fire standard examples into the Wonk system, so there is data on there that you can search on. So that is a nice thing to take a look at and create your code. So does the Wonk server have Swagger operations? No, we do not have those. So I'm sorry about that. But what we do have on the Wonk system is just We support every Fire resource type. We support every Fire search parameter that's out there for the resource types. And we support all of the interactions that are listed on the Fire API, the Restful API website. So if you take a look at those interactions, you should be able to put them to the Vonk server as well. Okay, so I think it is just about time. Are there any more questions that you want to ask me?
Yeah, thanks,
So
thanks, Mirjam. This was, yeah, it's a very, very educative session. And a lot of questions, a lot of answer that you gave. So thank you for having such a wonderful session.
Okay,
I
well,
hope
you're welcome. I
people
do
learned
know
a
that
lot
you
and they will now practice. Yeah.
Is it
yes.
possible for you to
So,
share the Is it possible for you to share the Postman collection?
Yes, I do not really have a Postman collection. So I did do some things on my local Vonk server, but that's probably not too interesting to you, I think.
Okay.
And other than that, I just requested a Fire observation, I think.
Okay.
But perhaps I have just put my email address in the chat. So if you have a particular question or want to know what the syntax is, then I would be happy to answer an email from you if you want to send that, and I can get into more detail then.
On Friday, there is
Because
a session
I would be
from
happy to
Mirjam
share
again
any,
on profiling.
Yes, so then on Friday, we will dive more into creation of profiles and other conformance resources. Okay, well, thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you have a very good continuation of this event. Perhaps you'll hear me on Friday again if you attend that session. But thank you so much for attending this one. And well, I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have still for me. Just drop me a line, an email, and I will be happy to answer it.
Thanks, Mirjam. It was a pleasure having you on the call. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.